Narrator, Stories from the Dark presents a journey into the shadows where truth blurs with imagination. I'm your host, and you're listening to Beneath the Surface, where we explore cases that challenge our understanding of human nature and the darkness that sometimes lies beneath ordinary lives. What you're about to hear contains mature themes and detailed descriptions of criminal investigations. Listener discretion is advised. Tonight, we dive into the darkness. Narrator, Pine Grove, Oregon. Population 15,400. A picturesque logging town nestled between the Cascade Mountains and dense forest land. The kind of close-knit community where people leave their doors unlocked and know the names of their neighbors' children. June 5th, 2022. The first Sunday of the month. Pine Grove Community Church had just finished its morning service. Congregants lingered on the lawn, enjoying the early summer sunshine. It was a scene of perfect small-town tranquility. For Dr. Maya Winters, it would be her last public appearance.
Dr. Thomas Grant. I remember seeing Maya that morning at church. She seemed preoccupied. We'd been colleagues at Pine Grove Memorial for nearly 5 years, both of us psychiatrists in a town that frankly needed more mental health resources than it had. She mentioned she was skipping the potluck lunch because she needed to prepare for an important patient session later that afternoon. Nothing about that struck me as unusual. Maya was always devoted to her patients, often at the expense of her social life.
Narrator. At 11:43 a.m., church security cameras captured Dr. Maya Winters, 36, walking to her car, a blue Subaru Outback. She exchanged brief pleasantries with Pastor Richard Coleman before departing. This mundane interaction would later be scrutinized by investigators for any signs of distress or forewarning. There were none.
Pastor Richard Coleman. Maya seemed perfectly normal that morning, perhaps a bit hurried, but that wasn't unusual for her. She mentioned she had work to do, thanked me for the sermon, and said she'd see me next Sunday. It was entirely unremarkable. If I'd known it would be our last conversation, I don't know what I would have done differently. Asked if she was okay, maybe, but there was absolutely no reason to think she wasn't.
Narrator. According to her calendar, Dr. Winters had blocked off Sunday afternoon for review of patient files and preparation for the upcoming week. As a respected psychiatrist in a small town with limited mental health resources, her patient load was substantial and diverse, ranging from teenagers with anxiety to elderly patients with dementia and everything in between. Dr. Winters lived alone in a modest 2-bedroom house on Evergreen Lane, about 3 miles from the church and 2 miles from Pine Grove Memorial Hospital, where she primarily practiced. Her home office was where she typically conducted her Sunday review sessions.
Emily Parker. Maya and I had been friends since she first moved to Pine Grove. I called her around 6:30 that evening to see if she wanted to grab dinner, but she didn't answer. I didn't think much of it. She often got absorbed in her work and lost track of time. When she still hadn't called back by the next morning, I sent a text. When that went unanswered too, I started to worry a little, but I figured she was just busy with patients on Monday.
Narrator, Monday, June 6th. When Dr. Winters failed to appear for her 9 a.m. appointment at Pine Grove Memorial, the hospital staff initially assumed a scheduling error. By 9:45 a.m., when calls to her cell phone went straight to voicemail, the hospital administrator, Judith Reynolds, contacted Emily Parker, known to be a close friend of Dr. Winters.
Judith Reynolds. Maya had never missed an appointment without notice in her 5 years with us. She was meticulous about her schedule and deeply committed to her patients. When she didn't show up and wasn't answering calls, I immediately knew something was wrong. This simply wasn't like her.
Narrator. Emily Parker used her spare key to check on Dr. Winters' home. She arrived at approximately 10:30 a.m.
Emily Parker. The house was immaculate. Too immaculate. Maya was generally neat, but this was different. There were no dishes in the sink, no papers on her desk, nothing out of place whatsoever. Felt staged somehow. Her car wasn't in the garage. Her purse and keys were gone. But her laptop was on her desk, which struck me as odd. She took that everywhere. And her phone charger was still plugged in by her bed. The strangest thing, though, was the whiteboard in her office. She used it for patient notes, and it had been completely erased. Not just erased, it looked like it had been meticulously cleaned with some kind of solvent. You could still smell it.
Narrator. Concerned by the unusual state of the house, Emily Parker called the Pine Grove Police Department at 10:52 a.m. Officer Derek Wilson responded to the call and arrived at Dr. Winter's residence at 11:14 a.m.
Officer Derek Wilson. Initially, we approached it as a welfare check. Ms. Parker explained her concerns, and while there was nothing overtly alarming, no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle, the circumstances were certainly unusual enough to warrant further investigation. Given Dr. Winter's position in the community and her perfect attendance record at work, her unexplained absence was concerning.
Narrator. Officer Wilson filed a missing person report. Given Dr. Winter's status as a healthcare provider with numerous vulnerable patients and the unusual circumstances, the case was escalated to the department's detective division within hours rather than waiting the customary 24 to 48 hours for missing adults. Detective Serena Navarro of the Pine Grove Police Department's Criminal Investigation Division was assigned to the case.
Detective Serena Navarro. When I arrived at Dr. Winter's home at approximately 2:30 p.m. on June 6, my first impression aligned with Officer Wilson's assessment. No obvious signs of foul play, but several highly unusual elements. The house appeared to have been methodically cleaned. Professional experience told me this could indicate several possibilities. Someone preparing for a planned absence, someone attempting to remove evidence, or someone with obsessive-compulsive tendencies having an episode. Given what we knew about Dr. Winters, the first two seemed more likely than the third.
Narrator. As Detective Navarro began her initial sweep of the house, she discovered something that dramatically changed the direction of the investigation.
Detective Serena Navarro. In Dr. Winters' home office, there was a small safe concealed behind a landscape painting. It was open and empty. According to Ms. Parker, who helped us inventory the house, this safe typically contained important documents, some emergency cash, and a thumb drive where Dr. Winters kept encrypted patient notes as a backup. All of these items were missing. The other significant finding was in the master bathroom. Behind the toilet, partially concealed by the tank, we found a crumpled note written on what appeared to be a page torn from a prescription pad. It read simply, "They found out. Not safe. Will contact when I can."
Narrator. This discovery transformed what might have been treated as a voluntary disappearance into a potential criminal investigation. Who had found out what? And why did Dr. Winters feel unsafe?
Detective Serena Navarro. We initiated a full investigation at that point. We began by examining Dr. Winters' phone records, financial activity, and recent patient interactions. We issued a bolo for her blue Subaru Outback. We interviewed hospital colleagues, friends, and the limited family she had. Just a sister in Seattle who reported having a good, but not particularly close relationship with Dr. Winters.
Narrator. Dr. Winters' phone records showed her last call had been to Dr. Thomas Grant, her colleague, at 4:32 p.m. on Sunday. The call lasted approximately 17 minutes. Her last text message was to Emily Parker at 5:15 p.m., saying she was diving into some complicated patient notes and would call her later.
Dr. Thomas Grant. Yes, Maya called me that afternoon. It was a professional consultation about a patient situation that concerned her. Due to confidentiality, I can't discuss the specifics, but I can say she was troubled by some information she had recently learned. She wanted my opinion on how to proceed ethically. Our conversation was collegial and productive. She thanked me for my input and said she was going to review some additional case notes before making a decision. There was nothing in her voice or words that suggested she was in any personal danger.
Narrator. Dr. Winters' financial records showed nothing unusual, no large withdrawals, no suspicious transactions. Her credit cards had not been used since a small charge at a local grocery store on Sunday morning before church. As for her car, there was no immediate sign of it in Pine Grove or the surrounding areas.
Detective Serena Navarro. On the morning of June 7th, approximately 36 hours after Drive Winters was last seen, We received a report that her Subaru had been found in the long-term parking lot at Portland International Airport, about 90 minutes from Pine Grove. Airport security footage confirmed the vehicle had entered the lot at 1:24 a.m. on Monday, June 6th. However, due to the camera angle and darkness, we couldn't clearly identify the driver.
Narrator, this discovery raised new questions. Had Dr. Winters fled by air? If so, to where? And why the middle of the night departure?
Detective Serena Navarro. We immediately requested passenger manifests for all flights departing Portland International after 1:30 a.m. on June 6th. Dr. Winters' name did not appear on any of them. We expanded our search to include flights throughout that day, checking for known aliases and possible variations of her name. Still nothing. We also reviewed all the security footage available, looking for anyone matching her description. Given the limited camera coverage and the high volume of travelers, this was challenging.
Narrator, while investigators were attempting to trace Dr. Winters' movements, they also began a deeper exploration into her professional life. As the only full-time psychiatrist at Pine Grove Memorial, she had a diverse and demanding patient load. Due to medical privacy laws, accessing her patient files required court orders, which Detective Navarro began pursuing. In the meantime, investigators turned to Dr. Thomas Grant, who had been covering Dr. Winters' patients in her absence.
Dr. Thomas Grant. I was doing my best to maintain continuity of care for Maya's patients, but it was challenging. Some were understandably distressed by her sudden absence. A few mentioned that she had seemed preoccupied in recent sessions, though that's not uncommon for psychiatrists who carry heavy emotional burdens from their work. One thing that did stand out was that Maya had recently been spending considerable time with a small group of patients who were all part of the same. Well, I suppose you'd call it a support group, though it wasn't one she'd organized through official channels. From what I gathered from her notes, these were individuals who all claimed to have had similar experiences that many in our profession would classify as delusional.
Narrator, this information caught Detective Navarro's attention. Court orders to access Dr. Winters' patient files came through on June 8th, and investigators began the painstaking process of reviewing her recent cases, looking for anything unusual.
Detective Serena Navarro. The files confirmed what Dr. Grant had mentioned. Dr. Winters had been seeing a group of 5 patients who shared a very specific belief system. They all claimed to be experiencing what they called reality bleed-through. Essentially, memories or experiences from alternate versions of themselves in parallel universes. Standard psychiatric practice would typically classify this as a shared delusional disorder, but Dr. Winters' notes showed a different approach. She appeared to be documenting their experiences in extensive detail, without immediately pathologizing them.
Narrator, the patients in question, 3 women and 2 men ranging in age from 27 to 65, had apparently found each other online in a forum dedicated to what they called dimensional shifts. They had separately sought psychiatric help and, by coincidence or design, had all ended up as patients of Dr. Winters.
Detective Serena Navarro. What made this particularly interesting was Dr. Winters' last set of notes. About 2 weeks before her disappearance, she began documenting her own experiences that mirrored what her patients were reporting. She described vivid dreams of a life she hadn't lived, memories that couldn't be reconciled with her known biography, and a growing sense that something fundamental about reality was unstable. If these were any other psychiatrist's notes, I might have concluded they were suffering from a psychological breakdown or perhaps over-identifying with their patients. But by all accounts, Dr. Winters was methodical, skeptical, and firmly grounded in evidence-based practice. These notes represented a significant departure from her usual clinical approach.
Narrator, as investigators were processing this unusual information, a new development shifted the case in yet another direction. On June 9th, for days after Dr. Winters' disappearance, her credit card was used at a motel in Oak Ridge, Oregon, a small town about 3 hours south of Pine Grove.
Detective Serena Navarro. We immediately dispatched officers to the location. The motel clerk confirmed that a woman matching Dr. Winters' description had checked in the previous evening, paying cash but using the credit card as a deposit. She had registered under the name Maria Williams and had requested a room at the far end of the property, away from the office.
Narrator. When officers arrived at room 17 of the Oak Ridge Pineview Motel, they found the door slightly ajar. Inside, the room showed signs of hasty departure, bed unmade, a half-empty cup of coffee on the nightstand, the bathroom light still on. But there was no sign of Dr. Winters. What they did find, however, was far more concerning than what they didn't.
Detective Serena Navarro. On the motel room desk, we found a composition notebook that contained what appeared to be a journal or log Dr. Winters had been keeping. The entries became increasingly paranoid over the course of several weeks, describing her belief that she was being monitored by them, and that the walls between worlds are thinning. The final entry, dated June 8th, read, "I've made contact with the others. We're meeting tonight. If my hypothesis is correct, this will be my last entry in this reality. If I'm wrong, I've lost my mind along with everything else." The most alarming discovery, though, was on the bathroom mirror. Written in what appeared to be lipstick were the words, "The echo chamber is real. They're coming through."
Narrator. Forensic teams processed the motel room, finding Dr. Winters' fingerprints throughout, confirming she had indeed been there. They also found strands of her hair in the shower drain, and her DNA on the coffee cup. What they didn't find was any sign of struggle or violence. The mystery deepened when investigators reviewed the motel's security footage.
Detective Serena Navarro. The exterior camera showed Dr. Winters arriving alone in a silver Toyota Camry, not her own vehicle, at approximately 8:15 p.m. on June 8th. She appeared nervous, but not under duress. The footage from early the next morning, around 3:20 a.m., showed her leaving the room with a small duffel bag, looking over her shoulder repeatedly. She walked out of frame, heading toward the back of the property, where there was a wooded area. No camera covered that area, and she was not seen returning to her room or exiting via the main driveway.
Narrator. The silver Toyota Camry was found in the motel parking lot. It had been reported stolen from a Portland suburb 2 days earlier. Inside, forensic technicians found a map with several locations circled in red pen, all small towns in Oregon, Washington, and Northern California. Oak Ridge was one of them. So was Pine Grove. Also in the vehicle was a folder containing printed emails between Dr. Winters and someone using the email address dimensional.traveler@securemail.com. The correspondence discussed theories about thin spots in reality and convergence points where parallel worlds might intersect.
Detective Serena Navarro. At this point, we had to consider multiple possibilities. 1. Dr. Winters was experiencing a psychiatric episode herself and had fled in a delusional state. 2. She was being manipulated by someone exploiting vulnerable people with mental health issues. Or 3. She had stumbled onto something regarding her patients that had put her in danger, and her apparent delusions were a cover for something else entirely.
Narrator. As the investigation continued, detectives began interviewing the 5 patients who had been part of the informal support group. This proved challenging, as 3 of them had also disappeared around the same time as Dr. Winters. The 2 remaining patients agreed to speak with investigators. Their accounts were remarkably similar. Patient A, Dr. Winters started out skeptical, like all doctors do. They hear you talk about memories from lives you haven't lived, about suddenly knowing things you shouldn't know, and they immediately think you're having a breakdown. But the difference with her was that she listened, really listened. About a month ago, something changed. She started asking different questions, more specific ones. She wanted coordinates of where we experience the strongest bleed-throughs, times of day, weather conditions. She was mapping it, she said. And then 2 weeks ago, she called me sounding different. She said she experienced it herself. She remembered a life where she'd never become a doctor, where she lived in New York, not Oregon. Details that couldn't be explained by simple imagination. That's when she told us about the echo chamber theory. Narrator. According to both patients, The echo chamber referred to Dr. Winter's hypothesis that certain locations acted as convergence points between parallel realities. Under specific conditions, which she was attempting to document, these points allowed for what she called dimensional resonance, where individuals could experience memories or sensations from their alternate selves in other realities. Patient B. The last time we all met as a group was 3 days before she disappeared. Dr. Winters said she'd identified what she believed to be a primary convergence point about 20 miles outside of town, in the old mining area. She planned to go there during the next window, which she calculated would occur on June 5th, between sunset and midnight. She seemed excited but also afraid. She said if she was right, it would change everything we understand about consciousness and reality. If she was wrong, well, she said that would almost be a relief. Living with the knowledge that reality is far more fragile than we think is a heavy burden. Narrator. This testimony led investigators to the abandoned mining area mentioned by the patient. The Blackwood Mine had been closed since the 1960s, with most of its structures reclaimed by the surrounding forest. It was located in a remote area with no cell service and limited access roads.
Detective Serena Navarro. We organized a search of the Blackwood Mine area on June 11th. It's difficult terrain, overgrown, partially collapsed in places, with numerous ways someone could get injured if they didn't know the area well. We brought in search dogs and a team experienced in that type of environment. At the main entrance to the mine, which had been sealed decades ago with a metal grate, we found something unexpected. The grate had been recently cut open, the metal still showing signs of fresh scoring from what was likely a portable cutting tool. About 20 feet inside the mine entrance, we discovered a circular arrangement of battery-powered lanterns. In the center was a sophisticated audio recording setup, including microphones positioned in a specific pattern and a digital recorder. There was also a journal, a different one from what we'd found at the motel, containing what appeared to be Dr. Winter's observations and measurements taken at the site over multiple visits.
Narrator. The most recent entry in the journal was dated June 5th, the day of Dr. Winter's disappearance. It contained a series of timestamps and notes documenting what she described as increasing resonance activity as the evening progressed. The final entry, time-stamped 11:47 p.m., simply stated, "It's opening. I can hear them. They can hear me. Hypothesis confirmed. God help us all." The digital recorder at the scene contained several hours of audio. Most of it captured nothing but the ambient sounds of the mine. Water dripping, occasional distant creaks and groans from the old structure. But the final 20 minutes of recording contained something that forensic audio analysts are still attempting to fully explain.
Detective Serena Navarro. The recording begins with Dr. Winters speaking in a clinical, observational tone, noting the time and conditions. Around the 11-minute mark, there's a change in the audio quality, a kind of oscillation or interference pattern. Dr. Winter's voice becomes increasingly excited as she notes that the resonance frequencies are aligning. At approximately 15 minutes in, you can hear what sounds like voices, multiple voices that seem to be coming from different directions, some of which sound remarkably like Dr. Winters herself, but speaking about entirely different circumstances and experiences. There's a rising static-like sound that builds until the 18-minute mark, when Dr. Winters exclaims, "The chamber is stabilizing. I can see." And then her voice cuts off abruptly. The remaining 2 minutes of audio capture only what sounds like wind, though audio experts note that the acoustic properties of the space shouldn't allow for that kind of sound. The recording ends without Dr. Winters' voice ever returning.
Narrator. Search teams combed the mine thoroughly, but found no other trace of Dr. Winters, no blood, no signs of struggle, nothing to indicate what might have happened to her after she stopped speaking on the recording. In the days following this discovery, several unusual reports emerged from the area surrounding Blackwood Mine. 3 separate hikers reported seeing a woman matching Dr. Winters' description walking through the forest, only to disappear when they called out to her. A local ranger described radio interference and compass malfunctions that he'd never experienced in 20 years of working in those woods. Most notably, on June 15th, 10 days after Dr. Winters' disappearance, Emily Parker received a handwritten letter postmarked from Pine Grove, despite no one having seen Dr. Winters in the area.
Emily Parker. The letter was definitely in Maya's handwriting. I've seen it enough to know. But the contents, they didn't make sense. She wrote about being between places and how time was moving differently for her now. She said she could sometimes see our world but couldn't fully return to it yet. She mentioned others who were transitioning with her and how they were learning to navigate what she called the in-between spaces. The most chilling part was at the end. She wrote, "Don't look for me, Em. Looking too hard at the spaces between realities can cause them to collapse entirely. I'm safe, I think. Different, but safe. And I promise when I understand it better, I'll find a way to explain it all. Until then, if you hear my voice calling from empty rooms or see me in places I couldn't possibly be, just keep walking. It's not me. Not exactly."
Narrator. Handwriting analysts confirmed the letter was indeed written by Dr. Winters, and the paper matched a stationery pad found in her home office. However, the postmark date, June 14th, created a timeline problem. How had she mailed a letter locally without being seen? And where had she been in the intervening days?
Detective Serena Navarro. The case of Dr. Maya Winters remains officially classified as a missing person investigation. We've explored multiple theories, from mental health crisis to foul play to possibilities that fall outside conventional explanation. What we know for certain is this. A respected psychiatrist with no history of mental illness began documenting unusual experiences reported by a specific group of her patients. She then reported having similar experiences herself. She conducted what appeared to be some kind of experiment at an abandoned mine during a specific time window she had calculated, after which she disappeared. 3 of her patients disappeared around the same time. None of their financial resources have been touched. None have been definitively cited since their disappearances. The remaining patients continue to report experiences consistent with what they call dimensional bleed-through, including reported sightings of Dr. Winters in impossible situations, appearing and disappearing, sometimes seeming to flicker like a bad television signal, and always near locations that Dr. Winters had marked in her research as potential convergence points.
Narrator. As of today, for months after her disappearance, the whereabouts of Dr. Maya Winters remain unknown. Her patients' files have been transferred to Dr. Thomas Grant, who reports that the phenomenon of shared delusions among the original group has not spread to other patients. The abandoned Blackwood Mine has been permanently sealed by authorities, citing structural safety concerns. However, locals report that strange sounds can sometimes be heard emanating from the sealed entrance on certain nights. Sounds that some describe as voices having conversations that seem to cut in and out like a radio scanning between stations. Emily Parker visits Dr. Winters' house once a week to collect mail and ensure everything remains in order. She reports that twice she has found items moved or rearranged when no one had been in the house. Most recently, a coffee mug placed on a book that she distinctly remembers putting away the week before.
Emily Parker. I don't know what happened to Maya. I don't know if she had some kind of breakdown or if someone manipulated her and those patients into believing something impossible, or if she actually discovered something that most of us aren't equipped to understand. I just know that my friend is gone, and sometimes when I'm in her house alone, I could swear I hear her voice coming from empty rooms, just like she wrote in her letter. And I do what she told me to do. Keep walking. But I never stop listening.
Narrator. The case of Dr. Maya Winters and what has come to be known as the echo chamber incident forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. How firm is our grip on what we call reality? What happens when a person trained in the scientific method encounters phenomena that science cannot readily explain? And when multiple people report the same seemingly impossible experiences, at what point do we question our understanding of what is possible? In Pine Grove, life has largely returned to normal. Dr. Thomas Grant has taken over Dr. Winters' practice permanently. The 3 patients who disappeared along with Dr. Winters have been officially declared missing persons, though the investigations have gone cold. The silver Toyota Camry was returned to its owner, who reported nothing unusual about it except a persistent electronic interference on the radio that occurs at seemingly random intervals. And occasionally, usually around sunset, visitors to the forest near Blackwood Mine report hearing a woman's voice reciting what sounds like scientific observations, a voice that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, describing the qualities of light and sound in what she calls this side of the echo. This has been the Echo Chamber Incident, Episode 2 of Beneath the Surface, a Stories from the Dark production. Join us next time as we explore another case from the shadows of our fictional world, where ordinary places harbor extraordinary stories. The following was a dramatization of events that took place in Pine Grove, Oregon, a city that exists only in our collective imagination. The stories, people, and places depicted are fictional. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. This has been Beneath the Surface, a Stories from the Dark production. Remember, sometimes the most terrifying stories are the ones that make us question what we believe to be true. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to our channel and sharing this with others who appreciate immersive audio experiences. Until next time, I'm your host, inviting you to look beneath the surface of the world around you. Because in the shadows, there are always stories waiting to be told. The stories presented in this podcast are works of fiction. Any resemblance to real people or actual events is entirely coincidental.